Welcome, everyone. You are in for quite a treat. This is a very, very special conversation with two reporters. Either one of them have amazing stories. Together, in some ways, it's like a dynamic duo with all of their experience and rich history. My name is Steve Rothstein, and I'm the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. And on behalf of all of the foundation team and the library team, we're honored you can be with us tonight. So thank you for being here. We appreciate it. We're also thrilled that in addition to a packed house, that we're doing a new thing tonight, that the John F. Kennedy Museum in Hyannis is live streaming this, which we're thrilled. So hello to our friends in Hyannis. And that they're going to be, during the question and answer period, some of the questions. So we're thrilled to include them as well. We also want to thank our sponsors, our lead sponsor, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Infinity, and WBUR. I also want to encourage all of you, you may or may not have had a chance to see, we have a special exhibit on Ernest Hemingway that'll be open to the end of the year. And if you haven't had a chance to see that, come back some other time. I also want to hope that each and every one of you joins us many times next year. Next year is the centennial of President Kennedy's birth. And we have a variety of activities ranging from activities here, online, in Washington, a new exhibit opening, 35 touch football games, and all kinds of other things, doing with NASA, Peace Corps, and so much more that we can talk about that. So if you're on a list, great. If you're not, let us know and we can make sure to get you that information. After the speaking part, John's going to be signing copies of his fantastic book that you can line up, and we're selling them in the gift shop as well. If you don't have them, I encourage you to do that. So again, we have an embarrassment of riches with John and Ann tonight. First, I'll talk about Ann for a second, and then John. Ann is in the position kind of asking questions as she's done to 7 different administrations and 7 different presidents and 10 presidential campaigns, and has so many acclaims. I mean, just a few of them, 6 Hall of Fames, 5 honorary university degrees. In some ways, she's kind of the Michael Phelps of reporting, and she's done so much and brings so much wisdom, and so we're thrilled that she's here, and maybe we'll get her to talk a little bit about that unique experience she had on the flight with President Bush on 9/11, one of only a very small group of reporters, and would love to hear more about that. But she's really here to interview John Dickerson and talk about Whistlestop, which is an amazing book. If a story is worth gold, this is worth the Fort Knox in terms of stories. There are so many great stories here that from a whole variety of campaigns. We've all seen and see John all the time on Face the Nation. And if you want to know kind of who's important that week, that's what you do. You turn on John and Face the Nation. He's also obviously Slate Magazine, political director of CBS News, and covered so many other areas. So I love all the stories. I am completely biased. I particularly like the one about John Kennedy in West Virginia, but all of them are great. So without further ado, Ann and John, thank you both.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful, huge crowd here. If history is best viewed in a rear-view mirror, when of course we have 20/20 vision, then the book Whistlestop may terrify you. We have, as a nation, have been through so many chaotic moments before. That's the genius of what John Dickerson has written in this basket full of campaign moments. It is a glorious whistle-stop ride through what John brilliantly calls broken links to history. And John, I've got to start if we are here at the John F. Kennedy Library. And I just went downstairs through the exhibits on his campaign. John Kennedy was elected as a young junior senator, kind of against the odds, against big-time established politicians like Hubert Humphrey. What
here, but also to be here with Anne. My mother was a journalist, and there weren't a lot of them around, and so I have a particular affinity and affection for pioneering women journalists, so I'm thrilled to be here with Anne. And who was also very nice to me when I was on the White House beat, too, not quite sure what I was doing on many of those trips. So my favorite moment in, so I tell the story of the West Virginia primary, which really starts in Wisconsin, where Kennedy's running against Humphrey, and and of course Kennedy has more money and has the beautiful family and has the plane that his father bought for him, and so he's able to hopscotch all over the state. And poor Humphrey is sloshing around on the snowy roads of Wisconsin in a Greyhound bus, and he's got an old army cot in the back where he's trying to catch a few moments of sleep because they're really running all across the state. And it's cold, and the cot that Humphrey is sleeping on is kind of banging against the bus. And Kennedy, on the other hand, looks very healthy, and he's warm, and he's got this financial advantage, and he's just crushing Humphrey. But the reason Wisconsin is so important, of course, is that it becomes a question of Kennedy's faith. And there are newspaper ads in which both Catholics and Protestants are arguing, to vote. There's an argument that basically Republican Catholics are going to turn out for Kennedy. And Kennedy's argument was, as a young senator, that he was going to use the primaries to build his stature, to create the stature that he could in no way compete with Johnson and the other larger figures in the Democratic Party who were running. So he would build it through the primaries, and if he could win in the primaries, he would show that he was strong enough to be president, even though he was such a young kid. And this is essentially what we've seen Barack Obama do. We saw it. It's what Marco Rubio tried to do. It's what a variety of senators have tried to do. So the results come in on election night in Wisconsin. And CBS has a Walter Cronkite has a relationship with IBM and the statisticians at Columbia University to look at to do what we now do with exit polls, but basically to try and explain the vote and what it means. And they're explaining the vote, and they can't stop talking about the Catholics turning out for Jack Kennedy. Now, why is this a problem? Well, A, because, of course, Kennedy didn't want to be the Catholic president in a country that wasn't ready for a Catholic president. But secondarily, he was trying to say that he was the man with the message, who understood the people, who had a view of foreign affairs, who had all of these important qualities that voters were voting for. If voters were voting for just because of where he went on Sunday to church, all of his qualities nobody would be talking about them. So, nevertheless, Cronkite is continuing to talk about this, and Bobby Kennedy calls Cronkite and yells at him and says, "Stop talking about the Catholic vote." Kennedy then gets on the phone with Frank Stanton, the president of CBS News, John Kennedy does, and says, if I win, I'll be naming people to the FCC. And, the FCC makes some determinations about licenses and your business. And so I guess the point there is that's how much the Catholic question and defining that victory in Wisconsin as a Catholic victory was eating at the Kennedy brothers. Of course, that didn't work. Front page of the headlines the next day were two bad things. One, that the Catholics had turned out for Kennedy, so it was seen just as a Catholic victory, but also that he hadn't done as well as everybody thought, even though at the beginning everybody thought that Humphrey was going to win because Minnesota is a neighboring state. So I haven't even gotten to West Virginia yet, but because of the CBS connection and that really hardball play, that's one of my favorite stories from that period.
And when you get then to West Virginia, little West Virginia, John Kennedy now has to prove he's a young junior senator, and he's still got Hubert Humphrey, the iconic Hubert Humphrey up there. So he now has to show it's not just the Catholic, that he has what it takes, the right stuff.
Exactly. That he's not just a Catholic. So the problem also is there's only 5% of the population of West Virginia is Catholic. So now he has a problem. He needed the Catholics in Wisconsin. Now he doesn't have any of them. Not only that, there's a great quote from Teddy White's Making of the President, in which a woman is interviewed in West Virginia, and she said, we shouldn't have a Catholic president. If they wanted us to have a Catholic president, they would have written it in the Constitution. So that's what he was up against. And so West Virginia, he had been, Kennedy was, among many things in this 1960 campaign, was an innovator in polling. And so they had polling in West Virginia that showed in the largest county that he was up by a massive margin over Humphrey. So he flies into West Virginia. He's hoarse to the point of ultimately he goes through parts of West Virginia and can't talk. Has to have his brother speak for him. There are some wonderful notes that he exchanged with Charlie Bartlett, the journalist and friend of his, who actually lives 2 blocks from me. Charlie, I still see Charlie out walking now and again, and they exchange notes because Kennedy can't talk. But he now has to fight it out in West Virginia, which he thought he wouldn't have to do, and the polling suddenly comes down to basically being neck and neck with Humphrey. And the Kennedy team surveys all the county chairs, all the Democratic county chairs, and they said, well, what happened? And they said, well, they discovered he's a Catholic. So the amazing thing that he does, and this is where you really see action in a campaign. Often campaigns don't have anything to do with the way presidents actually behave in office. But in this case, Kennedy, at first he tries to dodge the Catholic issue. He says what everybody here has probably heard or read this, his essential line, which was, when I fought for my country and when I took the oath of office, I didn't think about my religion. I thought about the Constitution. And he does that for a little while, and he realizes it's not working. So then he basically, what he did was he would say that and then move on to talk about something else. He then just grabs the issue and decides, okay, I'm going to own it, and I'm going to talk about this out loud. He ran ads about this. They had these town halls in which they basically filmed people standing up and asking him whether he would be ruled by the Pope. And then he would give his answer, and he basically just owned it. And the other thing he did was he spent every waking hour shaking hands, going to the mine opening, at 5 in the morning, and then at the closing, when the guys came lifted out of the mine, grimy faces before they went to the shower, he would shake hands with them. That was all captured, and they ran these very powerful ads of him with the miners in West Virginia.
And this is where the genius of the book connects it the way you and I would think about what we have just seen. At one point, Kennedy says, when machines put the miners out of work, what's going to happen to their families? It's not just the mines, it is all across this country, Kennedy warned. Machines are going to put people out of work, and we have to be ready. Whoa, that resonates not only with the industrial and mechanical and the manufacturing sector, but on trade. If trade is going to ship our jobs, so that thread 60 years later.
Absolutely. There's Kennedy didn't want to debate Humphrey because he said, basically, we agree on the same stuff and there's nothing to debate. It's just really about which of us can carry it off better. Then he decides he's losing in West Virginia, he wants to have a debate. And this is where, at the debate, he talks about, and what he does in the debate is what he's trying to do with the larger primary, which is show all the things he knows. He knows how many boxes of powdered eggs you get if you're on relief in West Virginia. He talks about the Eisenhower curtains, which are basically the boarded up houses of the miners who've lost their jobs and lost their homes. And so they've put the plywood up in the broken windows. And he starts to talk about the mills in Massachusetts and what happened as men were losing their jobs, what it did to their families as automation came in. And as Ann says in his discussion about the role of automation and what it does to these jobs, it feels like you're talking about Midwestern manufacturing today.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Why is it, John, that all of for every election that we go through, and I've been through 10, this was my 11th, which I spent here in Boston, but when we go through these, we think, man, this is the first time that it's never been more chaotic. It's never been more disorganized. It's never been more outrageous. It's never been more definitive, more historic. But it's almost all happened before.
It has. There are in this particular race, Donald Trump has taken us into some freshly plowed territory. But what's amazing, and we can talk about this later, is how much of it actually we have seen similar echoes before. I think the reason campaigns are sort of designed for high stakes moments. It fits a lot of activity. There's a lot on the line. You have these charismatic personalities running, and then they have behind them other charismatic personalities. And it has, as Mike Murphy used to say, who you know well, who ran the McCain campaign, ran Lamar Alexander's campaign, is a close friend of Jeb Bush's. He used to say, campaigns are war without bullets. So it has all of the high stakes energy, and so and striving, constant striving of these people, and so it's a situation ripe for these kinds of dramatic moments that we see in campaigns.
This is a good moment to ask you why you wrote this book, and it's obviously you've been working on it longer than just 2016.
I started working on it before I even was a journalist. When I first started, I was a secretary at Time Inc. I was trying to get a job at Time Magazine, where I ultimately worked. And I lived in New York, and I used to go to the Strand bookstore, and they had a little room at the Strand where there were all the old campaign books. So not just the Teddy White books, but Jules Witcover books, and Jack Germond, and everybody. Larry Barrett, who was a correspondent for Time for a long time, his book about the Reagan years. And they were all like $1. So I went in there and basically bought every one of these books that I could find, because I just loved the stories. And then covering campaigns, you're constantly thinking, is what's happening new? Is it old? Is there a parallel in the past that'll help me give me some understanding of the way things might break in the future? When they don't break the way they did in the past, then that's the thing you look at, because that's what tells you about what's new of the moment. And so as I started covering campaigns starting in '92, but really in '96, I was constantly going back to those books and looking for the threads and patterns. And a lot of them, as I went back and wrote this book, I found lots of the old plane tickets that I was using as bookmarks, and
right in the books themselves.
Yeah. And old the luggage tags. When you travel with a campaign, they put these laminated tags on your bags so that they know who's the press, whose bags belong to the press and who belongs to the staff, so that they can leave the bags for the press behind.
Well, actually, they're usually pretty good on that.
Yeah, no, they're amazing. And what Ann knows so well is the guy who carried your bags, in the '96 and 2000 races, is now, CEO of some company or is a senator from wherever. I mean, the people who are in charge of the bags, logistics is everything. And
from the Obama campaign in 2008, Eric Lesser is now a state senator here in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
A Harvard graduate. I knew there was a reason my bag showed up every night. Let me stay on this press issue a little bit, because I covered 10 campaigns, and then this past year I have retired completely from ABC News, and the Kennedy School called and offered me a fellowship. So I've watched this election not from inside the press pen where reporters are getting spit on, but from being on it, and it said, "Annoy the media, re-elect Bush." That was George Bush, the nice guy, the kinder and gentler. So John, the idea of the press being the villain is not new.
No, it's not new, and the press being totally wrong about the outcome is not new either. I mean, so everybody likes 1848, of course, the Dewey defeats Truman, but it's really throughout our history. It's very funny reading in the election of 1824, which I write about, all the early coverage of Andrew Jackson. There's all of this, he's not serious, he's not a serious candidate, he's just being put up for the job by people who want to elect John Quincy Adams. There's just like article after article getting it wrong all the way up until Jackson almost wins. So it's a rich part of the American tradition. But being the target, of course, in the early days, it was, when the press was totally partisan, the press was, they went after reporters, tried to hurt them, assassinate them. And then in those days also you had editors who would get into fistfights in the streets because they would often attack each other. So it'd be sort of if Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow just kind of went at it.
Good thing dueling is no longer legal.
But then, if you look at certainly, Wallace in 1968, another campaign where people thought, Wallace, he's just, Johnson's just having him run to give Nixon trouble. He's not a serious candidate. Wallace, the parallels with Donald Trump are amazing. Wallace, in every one of his campaign speeches, the press and the media and the pollsters were a constant, except for the pollsters who were good to him, which is another parallel of today, was a constant in his speeches to attack them.
What about an instance where Vice President of the United States is running to succeed Ronald Reagan, and George Herbert Walker Bush, and I remember covering the race, was considered by some to be kind of a wimp. He didn't really have his own policies, and he agrees to appear on John's network, CBS, live with Dan Rather on the evening news. Now, that is not a typical format, and it is the Bush advisor who is whispering in his ear saying, "You've got to do this." That advisor's name is Roger Ailes. Whatever happened to him? So tell us about that moment, the high-stakes moment for George Herbert Walker Bush, actually going on live into the Lion's Den.
Yeah, it's looking back on it, it's amazing. So the interview is going to be live on the evening news, which doesn't happen really almost ever. Basically what happens, as Ann says, that Bush is constantly trying to get out from under Reagan's shadow. And his advisors are constantly trying to leak stories to the press about how Bush is his own man and how he wants Ed Meese out of the administration. And Bush keeps telling Lee Atwater, who's working with Roger Ailes, stop trying to make me look tougher in the press. You're offending my sense of loyalty, which is many great qualities of George Herbert Walker Bush was his sense of loyalty to Reagan. And even though he felt that everybody underneath Reagan was kind of keeping him to the side, he nevertheless would do nothing and didn't want anything in the press that would make it look like Reagan was that elevated Bush at Reagan's expense. But this left him with a problem, because people were, and Newsweek put it very plainly on their cover, a famous cover story in which they had a picture of George Bush in a yellow rain slicker behind the wheel of his boat out, I guess, off of Kennebunkport, and the headline read, "Fighting the Wimp Factor." So in order to fight this, they basically staged a showdown with Dan Rather on the evening news. Now, the Bush people insisted that it be live because they didn't want it to be edited. And then they heard, according to Ailes' account of it, that Rather was really going to go after Bush. And there's a little post-history polishing of this story, as there are many of these. But anyway, the argument was going to be about Iran-Contra and Bush's role in it. And almost immediately, from the minute it begins, Rather and Bush get into a fight. when you go back and watch it, it's very hard to follow the fight. It's as television, two men are yelling at each other, and you're not really sure what and why. But what does come across is that George Bush is not taking any of whatever Dan Rather is giving him, and so he's very tough. And then he brings up Ailes is there in the room, and has on a piece of paper a reminder to Bush to bring up the time in Dan Rather's career when he walked off the set, which is a whole other story, but leaving blank air for 5 minutes?
6 minutes.
6 minutes. And so he says to Rather, basically, how would you like it if I defined your entire career by the 6 minutes you walked off the air? Which, it's a red flag to a bull. And it was all essentially for the purposes of making Bush look tough, because we have so often associated masculinity with the office of the presidency.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about how the press and the pollsters have not always gotten this prediction stuff right. But you also have a line. John writes, if there is a constant to the American campaign story, it is that elites cannot predict the future very well. Sound familiar? I expect that was written before November 8th, 2016.
It was, although I've always felt that it's just kind of and that's because when you go back and read these accounts, and you read about how certain everybody was that it was going to turn out this way, And then more often than not, turns out that way. Ed Muskie was going to win in '72. He had the Democratic nomination locked up. Howard Dean in 2004 was going to be the Democratic nominee.
Right. You write one section about comebacks, like Bill Clinton, the comeback kid in New Hampshire, but also about the campaigns that really collapsed. Comebacks, but collapses as well. Talk a little bit about Howard Dean, Edmund Muskie, and the third one was Michael
Eagleton.
Dukakis.
Well, Dukakis.
Former Massachusetts governor.
Yeah. I was just going to say one more point on the on the press getting things wrong. I've always felt like we should, in the press, but also just those around politics, should think of politics the way physicists think of physics, which is that they don't really know what black holes are, but they have to use terminology to talk about black holes because otherwise they would just sit there and be mute. But they go into their job recognizing A, they are likely to be wrong, B, the things they think and know are provisional, and there is a certain sense of excitement about how they're going to be proven wrong. Because if they're proven wrong, they've learned a new thing. And so there is delight and the expectation that the complicated, unknowable world is going to surprise them. That's the way we should cover politics, so that we know the voters are going to surprise us. That's what they do. News is what surprises us. We don't start the evening news and say, another 10,000 planes landed safely today. We are in the business of covering things that surprise us. So let's start that way so that we don't all seem so certain, and then when things surprise us, go, I wonder why it surprised us. It's because we're in the business of covering surprises. Anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a detour.
Start with the collapses. Michael Dukakis in the tank.
So the Dukakis story picks up from where we leave off with Dan Rather and George Herbert Walker Bush. While George Herbert Walker Bush is trying to elevate his stature as a sort of tough masculine guy, Lee Atwater has asked his head of research, James Pinkerton, to put on a 3x5 card the top liabilities for Michael Dukakis. And the 1988 campaign, which was one of the more dismal campaigns, Newsweek at the end of it said, if you like the 1988 campaign, you probably like oil slicks at the beach. He said to the head of research, find the most objectionable things that Dukakis has ever done. And the way they did that was they basically took an RV, and a bunch of kids just out of college came up to Massachusetts and studied everything that had ever been written about Michael Dukakis and anybody related to Michael Dukakis for his entire life. I mean, things he'd written about the Korean War while in school, stuff that Kitty Dukakis had written, and put it into this gargantuan set of binders, and then went through it and found all the most objectionable things. And that 3x5 card, which was, the writing was on both sides, but it represented the systematic dismantling of Michael Dukakis. And in the end, what that story is really about is, and Dukakis says this now himself, is that in a campaign where it's going to be fought on the grounds of masculinity, which is what, and patriotism and symbolism, that you have to fight back. George Bush would go to an event, you may very well have been there, at a flag plant or a plant that makes American flags, and Michael Dukakis would say, stop talking about the flag, I want to talk about health care. Well, meanwhile, people were hearing that Michael Dukakis didn't support amendments to keep flags from being burned, or didn't support the Pledge of Allegiance in schools. And so they were constantly painting him as outside of the mainstream. So as a kind of last-ditch attempt to reassert himself, to start playing in the game of symbolism that the Bush campaign had been playing for months and months, he holds this event at an Abrams plant manufacturer. Big speech on foreign policy, thoughtful, detailed, outlining his view on national security, but it is preceded by a photo op in which he goes into a tank. You've all seen this. And this was to fight back finally on the symbolic grounds that the Bush campaign had been running their campaign on. The problem is that it's hard to fight on symbolic grounds if you're just coming to it, because the symbolism of politics is a tricky thing. So as we all know, the one little thing I didn't know about the ride in the tank is that originally the photographs were supposed to be when the tank wasn't moving. So he wasn't going to have that helmet on, so it might have looked a little better. But all the photographers, both for the magazines and the television networks, once they saw him, so the tank started moving, and and he had to wear the helmet for safety reasons.
And his staff now tells me for communications, he couldn't hear the people briefing him unless he wore the Snoopy hat.
Yes, the Snoopy helmet, as the Bush campaign dubbed it. And there was an advance man at the event who apparently turned to another advance man and said, this is a really great event. You've just cost us the election. And apparently the press covering Dukakis at this event, and I think at least Sam Donaldson was there, but apparently as soon as he came out with the moving tank, they basically just doubled over. And the Bush folks had this footage, and they sat on it. They made an ad about it, and then they sat on it for about a month, and they ran it during the World Series. So it had...
Game 3.
Yeah, Game 3 of the World Series, and it had massive, massive exposure, and that was... so the lesson of that is, A, you know, if you're going to fight back, don't wait till the last minute, and then B, you sort of have to understand your symbols.
Another aspect of this that also has to do with CBS. I worked for ABC News for 41 years, but I started a CBS affiliate in Virginia. Was one of the comebacks despite a sex scandal, and it was 1992, and it was the young Arkansas governor named Bill Clinton. It's a fascinating comeback.
Well, it is because you mentioned Muskie earlier. There's a chapter on Muskie crying in New Hampshire which we can talk about later. But that story is really, in addition to the question of whether he was crying or it was snow, is really about expectations. Muskie wins in New Hampshire, but because he doesn't win by enough, the story coming out of it is McGovern. And we've seen this. It's also the story with Howard Dean. We see it all the time with these candidates who are supposed to have reached a certain level. And even if they win, if they don't reach that level, they've somehow lost. Bill Clinton is one of the few to totally reverse that. So not only does he have so there's a debate in which Cokie Roberts was moderating the debate. They asked each of the candidates, what's your biggest liability that Democrats might be worried about? She asked Bill Clinton about any women problems he may have had. He says, oh, you don't have to worry about that. If it was out there, people would know by now. You know, it's like you throw all the china up in the air in that moment before it smashes. So anyway, a couple of days later, the Jennifer Flowers thing goes crazy. It's everywhere. There are other kinds of stories. They go on 60 Minutes. And I guess what I had forgotten about the way the ball bounced in the New Hampshire primary was the two, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, go on 60 Minutes. Steve Kroft does the interview, and it's great television because basically Steve Kroft will not let it go, and at one point he talks about the arrangement in their marriage, and Bill Clinton comes alive. I mean, he later wrote, I think in his autobiography, that he was ready to kill him. And he said, you know, what you're looking at is two people who love each other. And it is what a lot of politicians know, which is the harder and tougher the question, the better it is for you because you rise to the moment and you look commanding. And Clinton is in command of that moment. It goes so well for the Clintons that polls the next day, ABC had a poll, 87% approval for him. CBS starts to get criticized for basically creating a public relations moment for the Clinton campaign. It's all going really, really well. Then the Wall Street Journal puts out a story a few days later about Clinton dodging the draft. And with new information on it, but it's a little bit sketchy. The story's not nailed entirely. But then Clinton in an interview says that the reason his story about the reason he went, basically he tried to get out of the draft, get out of going into the National Guard, or decided to go to the National Guard to get out of the draft, but then said he signed up again for the draft after 4 of his friends had been killed because he wanted to go to Vietnam. And nobody thought, wait, when their friends are killed, they don't rush to go into war. That doesn't make any sense. His answer in response to the questions about whether he had tried to dodge the draft by basically saying he was going into the National Guard and then getting out of it, came to represent that sort of Bill Clinton shilly-shallying with the truth. And the answers were devastating in terms of people just hearing in real time an answer that just didn't ring true to them. Nevertheless, he comes in second because it's an election about who cares about you, and no politician was better at conveying that he understood the troubles and problems of the voters in New Hampshire. but he still comes in second, and it's a pretty distant second, and yet he declares himself the comeback kid and wins the nomination.
And becomes president for 2 terms. Why is it, John, or have there been occasions before when 2 candidates have had such high negative responses from the American voters as we saw in 2016?
You have to go, I think it's, I've done this math a couple of times. You have to go back to 1884, which fortunately I wrote a chapter about. We didn't have approval ratings, of course, at the time, but in 1884 you had, on the one hand, you had Grover Cleveland running, and this was the election in which it was learned that he had an out-of-wedlock birth. Now, he was a bachelor, so nevertheless, however, he had a child out of wedlock with Maria Halpin, and that became a huge scandal. We think now about the sort of press's obsession with, and actually we're less obsessed than we used to be, but if you think about the Clinton years and the Gary Hart obsessive investigation into the private behavior of candidates, in 1884, there were newspapermen camped out in Buffalo trying to figure out what the truth of the story was. There were 5 separate newspaper investigations. It was a national story that he had this child, and of course the chant that would be heard at his rallies was "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" So
and the rest of the line is "Down at the White House, ha ha ha."
Well, that comes later.
Oh, okay.
That comes later. So the Republicans would show up at Cleveland's events and shout that. Now, he was running against James G. Blaine, who, and I won't go into it, but James G. Blaine had a series of scandals associated with him. This was his 3rd time trying to get his party's nomination. He finally got it. The reason he hadn't gotten it previously is because of these scandals, and one in particular, which was around these things called the Mulligan letters, which are basically, when Blaine was Speaker of the House, he arranged it so that a railroad could get a favorable land deal, basically get the land to put their railroad down, and in exchange, he got bonds with the railroad. That turns out was all legal back then. But what happened was the bonds were bought back at way above market value, and that was not legal. He denied it all and was basically about to, the Judiciary Committee investigated him in the House. He was about to basically win. He was a great orator, and everybody loved him. They called him the magnetic man. The Democrats and Republicans loved him. He was just this just perfect politician. And he was about to basically get out of the rap, and these letters appeared in which he basically outlined the scheme of how to cover his behind and cover the story of how he'd gotten paid off. The clerk who delivered these letters, his name was Mulligan. Blaine basically goes to him and says, can I see those letters that you've got? Because I just want to make sure they're mine. Mulligan gives them to him, and he looks at them. And this is back at his hotel after the Judiciary Committee hearing. And then Blaine gives them back to Mulligan. And then they talk a little bit more. Blaine tries to offer him a job, tries to offer him some money to give up the letters. And they said, can I just look at those letters one more time, his personal correspondence? So Mulligan gives it to him a second time. Blaine takes off, steals the letters. So you had a campaign in which the private correspondence of one of the destruction of the private correspondence of one of the candidates was an issue in 1884. He didn't have his own private server, but it was similar. So you had Blaine with the Mulligan letters versus the out-of-wedlock birth with Cleveland. Cleveland wins, and so then when he wins, the chant, which was "Mama, where's my pa?" Democrats responded, "Gone to the White House, ha ha ha."
See, it all really does kind of come back. Was there any, we're going to open this to questions in just a few minutes, but was there ever an election as ugly as the year 1800, when the country was so new? Yeah, it was, I think what's interesting about, so the election of 1800 was awfully ugly because of this partisan press, because you had hundreds of newspapers, newspapers that supported the Jeffersonian Republicans and then the Federalists. What was different, although maybe worse than today, is that basically Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams, they all hid behind the
their correspondents. So they would employ people at the newspapers to just savage their opponents. And then they would say, oh, well, these papers are so vicious. How can this be? But it allowed them to be men of virtue while they were basically paying and writing the checks.
Basically, at that point, President Washington had been, by acclamation twice. John Adams was ascended to the presidency. But back in those days, you did not go out and campaign. You did not go out and give speeches saying, vote for me. You had these representatives go out for you, which fed into this mix.
Yeah.
And it was vicious.
To campaign for the job was to show you weren't worthy of it, because the idea back then was if you were a man of virtue, you would be elevated by your peers, and they would know and they would promote you as a man of virtue. And if you were to go out and campaign, you might make promises for the purposes of getting the vote that you would then try to keep in office. And you wouldn't want to do that because when you're in office, you're supposed to determine what's right based on the facts before you, not based on any promises that you might have made during a campaign. So you never did that. But while Washington's still president, he calls out Jefferson, mostly because Hamilton is saying, you can't let your Secretary of State keep savaging us in the papers and let him get away with it. And Jefferson would not only write anonymous tracts against Hamilton and Washington, but employ people to do it. And then the people he employed, he would give them confidential documents in order to make his case. And at one point, Washington calls him out, and Jefferson writes a 3,000-word explanation of how he didn't have anything to do with it, which, as anyone here knows, when you have to write 3,000 words about how you didn't do it, you did it. Yeah.
Let's fast forward to now. What do you think of the first hours emerging of the Trump ascendancy and how he's gone about making that transition from a candidate who has never served one day in elective office to someone who is now going to have to govern? And how do you see that unfolding now?
Well, I was thinking of John Kennedy because there's a quote of his that I really love, which is when he first came into the presidency, he said, I spent so much time trying to get elected president. I wish I'd spent more time talking to people who would help me be president. And Newt Gingrich said recently when I was talking to him on the Face of the Nation that basically Trump has said, this looks like a lot harder job than I expected. And so there is the shock of the duties and the shock of those things that are on your shoulders. You cannot outsource them as a president. So I think we're seeing some of that happening. I think we are seeing obviously lots of both loyalists when you see Jeff Sessions and you see Mike Flynn going into National Security Advisor. You see people who were with Trump for a long time being part of his inner circle. You then see ideological loyalists, both at HHS and now at EPA, people who believe in or share Trump's worldview. Obviously, we're all. James Mattis is a really interesting pick at the Pentagon. He was not involved with Donald Trump at all. Mattis is one of the big questions about Donald Trump is how much advice he takes from anyone. And we see his advisors having to go on TV in some instances to try to influence him. We see a lot of...
Like Kellyanne Conway bad-mouthing Romney.
Right. So the question is, and Ann knows this so well, George W. Bush used to talk about this with his father, that people would stand outside the Oval Office and say, I'm going to really go in there and I'm going to tell him that he's wrong about this and this and this, and he's got this wrong, and he just doesn't know what he's doing. And then the minute they walk into the Oval Office, they say, oh, Mr. President, that's a lovely tie. How are you? They just totally quail in front of the president. So Donald Trump, is a very strong-willed person. So who's going to tell him no? James Mattis has a career of telling people no, and so he's on the opposite end of Trump on waterboarding, on Iran, on a variety of issues. So that's an interesting pick. Secretary of State is the most interesting one left because if he does pick Romney, he will have picked somebody who was his most vocal critic, basically.
And the standard bearer of the party 4 years earlier. Yeah. and someone who had a distinguished career as a governor, and it is picking somebody from the ultimate Republican establishment. A fellow at Harvard last week told me, he says, Romney's asked me advice before. He hasn't asked me about this, but if he does, I'm gonna tell him, if you do this, you know that you will clash with the president. Who's going to win those arguments? Are you going to win them, or is President Trump going to win them? I also am curious, for each Republican who adds a Democrat or two to the cabinet, or each Democrat who adds a Republican, haven't seen any bipartisan. Do you think it's because no Democrat would want to work for this administration? Well,
I think they're still flirting with Joe Manchin, I think, at Energy. But I think generally you're right. That's the case. And I can't think of any other significant, well, there aren't many left, but I think that's right. I mean, then of course the great question will be, what is Chuck Schumer going to do? Because I think Donald Trump really wants to make some deals. He wants to get some things done. He's not ideological about a lot of things, so he would be willing to cut a deal.
Fellow New Yorker, somebody he's known for years.
And as long as he gets to call it whatever he wants to call it, the underlying details of the deal can be quite different from whatever he's calling it. And so Chuck Schumer could get a lot of stuff that he wants as long as Donald Trump gets to frame it in the way he wants. And Schumer has a big challenge because, as you know, the landscape for Democrats in the Senate, a lot of them are running in states. I believe it's 10 states that Donald Trump won. So you've got Democrats running for re-election in 10 states that Donald Trump won. That means it's a tough. It's a
nightmare map for the Democrats coming up. Last question before I open this up to the audience. The Electoral College has been with us from the beginning. There are those who say if we've had two elections in 2000 and now 2016, where the winner of the popular vote, this time by a significant margin, well over 2 million. Al Gore won by about 500,000. Do you get a sense, either from history or from contemporary conversation, that the Electoral College might be addressed and might be vulnerable at this point?
Well, I don't. I mean, I think it's addressed, it's talked about, but I don't see it. I mean, I feel like the desire to move on. I mean, when Nancy Pelosi says he's our president, and then already talks about how she's going to work with him. Bernie Sanders, he's our president. I think everybody, the power to move on is overwhelming.
And there are conservative Republicans who make the argument, if we got rid of the Electoral College, presidential candidates would campaign in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, West Coast, and the rest of the country, states like West Virginia and Wisconsin and Nevada, which mattered, which got attention, would be flyover states and would never see a presidential candidate again.
That's right. That's right.
Let us maybe turn up the lights a little bit and open this up to questions from not only this audience in here. There are two microphones in the aisle, one right here and one right here. I'm going to start in this, and please tell us your name, and as they like to say at Harvard, make sure your question has a question mark at the end.
Absolutely. Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Ellen, and I came all the way from Cape Cod to see you both. It's really great to be here. I have a question about the media. Do you think you get it wrong? It's just my sense this might be possible. Because you know these people on a social level. And so you have opinions before you even go in about who you could get along with, who can win, and so forth. I mean, there's such a cohesiveness between the media and the candidates, it seems to me.
Yeah, we don't know them that well. Nobody knew Donald Trump. I think the Washington that my mother covered in the 1960s, they did all know each other. They were still getting it wrong then too, but there's not really that much of a cohesiveness. And to the so I think where that affects coverage and public policy is actually when public policy is made. I mean, I think the relationships in Washington, that people have been there for a long time, have affect, both for good and ill, the way in which we cover what happens in Washington. But in presidential campaigns, I mean, especially again when you have Donald Trump, who nobody knew from the political press corps in any significant way, I don't think it really plays. I don't think it really plays a role. I mean, I think the familiarity of reporters with Hillary Clinton probably hurt her. I mean,
I covered her for 24 years, just her national spotlight years. And I do think as a reporter, that didn't make me closer or more distant. I did cover her in 2008. I think reporters are reporters. And if they can use their contacts with a candidate to get interviews and to have her stop at a rope line and answer a question, that works. But I do think it played, you raise an important point here, because so looking at this election from the outside looking in, I think reporters looked at this election and they saw what they thought was supposed to happen. Not that they were supporters of Hillary Clinton, I don't buy all that, but because they looked and said, well, this is what generally happens in presidential elections. And sometimes we really have to fight and make sure that we don't go into a story seeing what we think should be there, and open our eyes and see what's really there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi. Hello. Hi, I'm Gordon from Gloucester. My question is this. In the morning, with the spectacular Charlie and Nora and Gail, your incredible interaction with them. One, what is that like? And B, is there real editorial give and take going on? Is that all pre-scripted and on the rails? And is there also real editorial behind the scenes give and take between you superstars?
So it's great fun in the morning. There are attempts to not script it, but to know where we're going, because they have time. You know, we got to fit in between commercials. Also, they want to roll in pictures and polling, and you know, if I make a reference to, you know, Jack Kennedy, they want to have a picture of Jack Kennedy to remind people who he was. And they try and set that kind of stuff up, and then it all goes to hell once we start talking, because mostly it's a conversation, and because the hosts want to know what they want to know. Sometimes it's so it's mostly all improvised, and then we run out of time, and we got lots more to talk about, and so we have hurried conversations in the 30 or 60 seconds between when the segment is stopped and when the next one stops. So sometimes you'll see as the next segment begins, I'm sometimes ducking to get out of the shot for whatever's coming on next. It's a lot of fun. It's because they are all enthusiasts and they're all really curious. So they, you can see it, and I have this problem on Face the Nation. There's a lot of leaning in because you're trying to, like, you know, I don't know, physically get at the information. So if you watch our conversations, a lot of times the camera, they don't like it because we lean in too much. On Face the Nation, I do it all the time and block the shot of the guest, which drives them crazy. But that's the way I am.
Yes, young man.
Thank you for speaking to us. So I thought one of the interesting things about this election was that Donald Trump was mostly opposed by the Republican establishment, and yet he still rose to be the front runner of the Republican Party. Can you think of any historical parallels to this?
Great.
Why, yes, I can. It's a great question, and this is one of the reasons, you know, why I've looked at history through my whole career, and why it was helpful here. So in 1964, Barry Goldwater is the nominee of the Republican Party, and there is a huge split in the Republican Party. Not as big a one as there was in this campaign, but it was a big one. And there was even to the last minute when they went to this was when they used to have conventions where things were actually unscripted and up for grabs, and you didn't know who the nominee was going to be. The governor of Pennsylvania ran against Goldwater, tried to kind of at the last minute the governors all got together and said, we can't have this guy be the nominee of our party. He's going to get destroyed. I mean, he's just going to get, and then we're going to lose in the House and Senate. We're going to lose in the governorships. So they tried to get various people. George Romney, the father of Mitt Romney, was at one point, Richard Nixon was trying to get him to run. There's a famous meeting, the two of them meet in a bathroom, and Nixon's trying to get Romney to run. Romney thinks he's trying to get him to run so he'll lose, so that Nixon can later rise. There's a lot going on. But Nelson Rockefeller gets up on the podium, and basically the reason the Republicans were so angry or worried about Goldwater is he was appealing to / gaining the support of, and this is a big debate, people who were against the civil rights changes as a part of the Civil Rights Act, which Barry Goldwater had voted against. Goldwater had voted against it on constitutional grounds. There were a lot of people who didn't want the Civil Rights Act on racial grounds. And the Republican Party was worried they would be doomed as a kind of ancient mastodon of a party if they didn't sort of move a little bit towards civil rights. Anyway, Nelson Rockefeller stands up and talks about bigotry and extremism in the Republican Party and is shouted down by all of Goldwater's supporters who are in the Cow Palace in San Francisco where the convention is taking place. And there's this massive split in the Republican Party. Turns out in that case, Goldwater got just destroyed by Lyndon Johnson, and so the predictions were true. But a lot of these dire predictions that were made about Donald Trump sound very much like what was said in 1964.
Thanks very much. Yes, question here.
Well, as we say on PBS, I'm Brian from Duxbury. But my question is on the technology of polling. What is it now? What has it been? I read that they are using landlines to sample the public. Nowadays, we all have cell phones. How can they, don't say get things so wrong, because that's another story. But how can the science of polling, which is well known in science how you do it, and you have sample groups, you have focus groups, advertising knows how to do it, what went wrong, and secondly, what is the solution? What new methodology should we be using?
Good
One more
question.
comment, by the way, about the media. I have, won't say friends, but I have acquaintances who are Trump voters, and they do talk about the media, and the media got it wrong. David Trump, who's a good conservative, said all the time, I keep getting it wrong, keep getting it wrong. But I think the reason is that this guy was totally out of the picture. He was not a left-winger, not a right-winger. He was a showman, and I don't think the media or the rest of the world ever caught on to that fact. That's just a comment.
Thank you very much. John,
So
polling.
on polling, the problem with landlines has been well known to pollsters for the last many cycles. So they don't use just landlines. They use lots of different methods. They use lots of cell phone calling, and then now also there's been a lot of innovation in online polling, where you can get a much bigger group of people, but it has its fuzziness because people are opting in a way with online polling that's a little that can cause problems. So there have been, but the big problem with polling is that even on cell phones, people don't pick up the phone if they don't recognize the number, and so pollsters recognize that flaw. And they try to make up for it by using other methods or making estimates about the size of, about who would vote. The problem is when they make those estimates, that's where you get into problems. Now, the national polling turns out was not that wrong. I mean, Hillary Clinton is going to, wind up with 2 million plus votes more than Donald Trump, and that's about where if she was up, a few points in the national polling, that's closer, certainly within the margin of error. The problem was in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, Michigan. Now, the problem is that in Michigan, not that many people were polling it because everybody thought it was done. It was a traditionally blue state, and why poll in Michigan? Ohio is the big problem because there was a lot of polling done in Ohio. And the problem in that instance was that the polls got the separation among non-college white voters, where Donald Trump was crushing Hillary Clinton among non-college white voters. What they missed was how many of them, or what they underestimated was how many of them would ultimately turn out to vote. So they got nobody missed where the Trump voter was. They just didn't know that as many of them were going to turn out. Then on the other hand, they also missed that Hillary Clinton would underperform with African Americans, millennials. And so if you're wrong a little bit on both of those assumptions, it can make your big miss. It can make your miss pretty big. Everybody was wrong, including both the Trump people only had him a 30% chance of winning. I got a call from a leading Senate Republican the day before the election giving me a list of all the things that Hillary Clinton was going to have to do to reach out to Republicans after she won. It was everybody was wrong.
Can I tell you a little story? I know this is John's show, but I love the moment when John Kerry was running for president, and I was in the Air Force One travel pool with President George W. Bush when he went to vote in Crawford that morning. And his staff was standing outside, they're kicking the dirt around with their toe of their shoes. They all looked like they just lost, they just looked miserable. President Bush and Laura Bush cast their votes. They came out and told the small group of press traveling with them that he said, look, I've done my best. It's now in the hands of the American people. I thought, oh my God, he must have polling that shows this. We get onto the press, onto Air Force One. We start looking at the early exit polls, which we see, but we never put on the air because they're not reliable. And John Kerry is sweeping it. We actually on Air Force One discussed whether Kerry would have his transition offices in Boston or in Washington. Of course, by the time we landed back in Washington in early evening, the tables had turned.
I was on that flight. I was because and everything Ann says is true. They looked like they had turbulence when they got off Air Force One. They thought, now, this is a very important point, is that should have taught and did teach a lot of us the lesson about exit polls, which is the first wave of exit polls is always wrong. Ann knows that. I know that. Other people know that. Some people, astoundingly, in the business, don't know that. And so there were, either they don't know it or they just choose not to know it. Yeah. Because there are a lot of people who want to know, this goes back to the physics point, who want to be certain about things and show that they're certain 5 minutes before something happens because that's the way they gain currency. You should always know, and this was another case, the first wave of exit polls had Hillary Clinton doing very well. It's almost a negative indicator. If you're doing well in the first wave of exit polls, that's bad news for you, is my view now.
Cancel the champagne.
Yeah.
We're going to try to get to all of these questions. They're great. Good evening.
I'm Nancy Corman, and I'd like your opinions on why Hillary Clinton lost.
Well, I think, I think there's a lot of different things. So basically, she didn't turn out millennials, African American voters, and also college white women who she thought she was going to have a huge margin with. It wasn't as big. There were a lot of basically Republican college-educated women who had been telling pollsters they weren't going to vote against Trump, who ultimately did vote for him. So those are the and they tended to vote. When his vote is going up in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and hers is going down. That's the numerical reason. But I think more broadly, the challenges she had a number of them. One, I think, was best summed up by her pollster, who in one of the WikiLeaks hacked emails, there's the pollster saying, does she, meaning Hillary Clinton, have an idea of what her message is? In other words, they were still, now to be fair, this was in 2015, but that was a consistent problem for her campaign, that as much as people may have mocked Make America Great Again, it was a single, blunt message that people knew that was what Donald Trump wanted. It was a gut-level emotional appeal. And I talked to several strategists in previous campaigns who, throughout the campaign, would say, the challenge for Hillary Clinton is she is trying to break an emotional connection that Donald Trump with his voter, that he has with his voters, with an argument of reason. And voters oftentimes will make their decisions based purely on gut-level feelings about, it gets mocked a lot, but the idea that, the person you want to have a beer with, that's the way a lot of people cast and feel about their vote. And so I think because she never had a single message that people felt sort of right in their chest, excuse me, that was more powerful than I meant it to be. That was a deficiency. I think certainly the WikiLeaks emails and the James Comey, the Trump people will now admit, and certainly the Democrats working in the House races saw that when James Comey released his first letter, a number of Republicans who had been worried about Donald Trump were reintroduced to what 8 years or 4 or 8 years of Hillary Clinton would be like. Just kind of the drama. And when Hillary Clinton then went and attacked Comey, she didn't, but her campaign did. People thought, oh, it's going to be this for 4 years. And Republicans who were reluctant about Trump were given afresh, in real time, a vision of what a Clinton presidency might be like. And that may have depressed Democratic turnout, but it enlivened Republicans. So those are some of the reasons. And she set up a private server outside the rules of the administration she worked for, and then was not forthcoming about it when she was asked about it. That's
right here.
Hi, I'm Ed Langton, and my question is, as you mentioned a bit ago, most people think, or a lot of people think, that Donald Trump is a pragmatist at heart, and yet all his cabinet picks have been strong conservatives. So how do you reconcile that?
I think that he's a pragmatist on the stuff he cares about and wants to do. So, this deal with Carrier is an interesting example. He wanted the show, the details. He's willing to, let them off the hook on the big penalty he was going to threaten them with. He's willing to, let a bunch of jobs still leave to go to Mexico. He wants the incredible public relations coup that he got, and everything else is, can be worked out. So those are the things he's working on. But at the agencies where a lot of incredibly important decisions are going to be made, and that's arguably going to be one of the most important stories in the Trump presidency, is all the things that are going to happen at the agencies, because he wants to focus on what he wants to focus on. He's not going to be paying attention. I think he's happy to have those staffed with conservatives and let them do it's not that he will be offended if they do conservative things. It's just when it comes to deal making. So when it comes to Obamacare and infrastructure and even budgeting, he'll be in a mood to make deals on those core things, and he's happy if there are conservative outcomes at the agencies.
So long as they're winning. Yes.
Right.
Yes, I'm actually asking the question for the Hyannis JFK Museum.
Okay, Hyannis,
so this is
welcome.
coming from Hyannis. In the election of 1840, William Henry Harrison's campaign lied about his log cabin roots and about Van Buren. Was it as nasty as what just happened in 2016?
It was, so in 1840, it was a single Baltimore newspaper columnist who said Harrison's too old to run for president. He really wants to sit by the stream, by his log cabin, and drink hard cider and study moral philosophy. The Whigs turned that into the greatest act of public umbrage taking we've ever seen, which is basically, they said, how dare you make fun of the common man's love for hard cider and the humble beginnings of a log cabin, and they ran the entire campaign on that. It was all, they had these full day long Whig parades where life-sized log cabins on wheels would be rolled down the street. And that's why you see still today, we see the log cabin in the Republican Party. And there were some attacks. They called Harrison old granny, and it was Van Buren they attacked for being, so as the questioner points out, William Henry Harrison grew up in a house with a huge, big house with lots of architectural fancy pieces. Van Buren grew up at the top of a tavern with like 11 siblings, I think. So Van Buren was the one who had the hardscrabble upbringing. The problem is Van Buren was in the White House, and so they painted him as this profligate spender of public money. This is after the crash of 1837, so the country was nervous about this. But there was a 3-day, a member of the House went on for 3 days about an appropriation for basically the shrubbery around the White House. It's called the Gold Spoon Oration, and it is, go look it up. It is the most extraordinary purple prose, and basically attacks Van Buren for 3 days for being a spendthrift and wasting the public's money, and they basically completely reverse the two. But it wasn't nasty, ugly like 1800 or like campaigns. I mean, it was distorted, but it didn't get ugly.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Peter Clay. I'm from Des Moines, Iowa.
Yay.
And my question has to do with how you think the press is doing in helping all of us understand what's the status of the integrity of our vote. I know that our president-elect has, without apparent evidence, said that millions of votes were wrongly cast, but has also attacked recount efforts that might establish some factual basis for looking at that. A story I read somewhere, I don't remember, said that approximately 20% of the votes have no paper backup, and that's the decision of the states. They conduct the elections. Each state gets to choose how they do it. It's not a technical problem. All states could do it with paper backup. Where are we really at, and how is the press doing in making sure that citizens, voters, can have confidence that votes are properly counted? I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's a good question. So you have part of the problem is, as you point out, trying to separate the real from the fake. And so among that, and playing a role in that is Donald Trump has claimed without evidence that several millions of votes were cast in California. There's no evidence of that. So that's the first challenge and problem. You also, another part of the story, of course, is the whatever Russian hacking contributed to or didn't contribute to. We know that they hacked, or at least intelligence officials know that they hacked and are a part of the Podesta emails that were leaked, and then the Democratic National Committee's emails. So the vote was affected by that. But then there are these stories about, and there are, and Republicans and Democrats have asked for congressional inquiry into Russian efforts to destabilize the actual voting itself that took place, the machines. I think it's being covered. I don't think it's being covered with the ferocity of all the other things that are going on right now, in part because the other things that are going on are pretty important too. And I'm not sure there's I'm not sure that I have a hopeful place to land at the end of the day here. In terms of, I think I think unless you get a congressional inquiry, you're still going to have your questions. You need a formal inquiry to get at all these, because it's such an atomized system in the states. You need a big federal inquiry into this, and I don't know that there's any interest in that.
No appetite.
No appetite, other than on the perhaps this Russian angle, except for given what the president's-elect's softer view towards Russia is. I don't know that even is going to happen.
Yes, question right here.
Oops, excuse me. Kevin Lohan, Quincy, Massachusetts. What lessons do you think the media learns from the coverage of this past presidential election? And if any lessons have been learned, how, if at all, do you think that will affect the coverage of the next presidential election? In other words, it doesn't seem like there was a lot of investigative reporting that was done on the candidates. A lot of the things that turned up very, very late, and many of the comments made by the president-elect were made in public venues, like on the Howard Stern show and Access Hollywood, or whatever that incident was. And none of that seemed to come up until very, very, very late. And is the reason for that because the media didn't do a good job with its investigative reporting, and it spent too much time in New York and Washington, D.C.?
So there's a lot in that question. So the New York and Washington, D.C. question is a question about whether the press is too insular and missed the voters who were voting for Donald Trump. That's separate and apart from the inquiry into both the Trump and Clinton campaigns. Just on that first point, as somebody who's covered the conservative movement since the early 90s, I covered Pat Buchanan in 92 and 96. I covered the Tea Party movement. Anybody who's covered Republican politics knew that this was out there. I think there's a lot of us spent a lot of time covering the grassroots conservatives and the unhappiness they have had over time with the Republican Party. I think what surprised me and I won't speak for others, was that what I have heard, and in this case, it's because I spent too much time out in the country. Voters would say, I don't want politicians who say one thing and do another. I want people who stick to their principles and don't change under pressure. Well, Donald Trump has changed his position, including whether he's a Democrat or a Republican, and on key issues like abortion, in ways that boggle the mind relative to what I have heard my entire career from grassroots conservatives about the single property they want, which is fixity of ideological stance. So that was something that I always thought, well, they may love him because he's punching the system in the nose, but ultimately, because they want the person to be stable in the Oval Office on these certain set of principles, they won't go for Donald Trump. So second, but quickly on the question of investigative, there are two different parts I think there were lots of investigative stories about Donald Trump in major newspapers and on the networks, and also in Hillary Clinton. Obviously, the server story itself was the product of investigation. I think that's one set of things, which is investigations into the regular old meat and potatoes of what we do. His business dealings, such as they could be found out, his personal behavior, such as it related to the office, his history, all of that as well with Hillary Clinton. There was a lot of that out there, and there was certainly a lot of coverage of their policy proposals as they would play out. Then there's the secondary set of things with Donald Trump, which are the incendiary things he said. I think that one of the things to be wrestled with his candidacy is a lot of people felt like, oh, he says these things that are so outrageous, and yet he's still doing well. It must be that the press isn't covering him. For me, where the logic of that falls apart a little bit is people knew, of all the things they knew of Donald Trump, they most probably knew the really toughest stuff. I mean, the fact that he started on June 16th in 2015 talking about Mexicans coming to America being rapists. They knew certainly about the Access Hollywood thing. They knew about, in the first debate, that first question to him about all the things he'd said about women, and on and on and on. People, in the things that they knew most of all about Donald Trump was that incendiary stuff. So for me, it's hard to believe that if you knew all the super incendiary stuff, then the eighth thing you learn is that his tax policies will be unfavorable for the middle class, that you're going to say, I was with him on the stuff he said about groping women, but boy, I'm right out. There's no way I'm voting for him on marginal tax rates. So that seems to me I think people did the investigative stuff, and I think B, even if they'd done 100% more, the voters who wanted to vote for him were so angry about Washington and the elites in their party and having gotten the wrong end of all the bad decisions in Washington that they were going to vote for him anyway, and Hillary Clinton's voters weren't going to vote for her.
And I would just kick in that I think the way news is now delivered, there was a ton of good investigative work done, including by the Boston Globe as well as so many of the big newspapers. But the way news is delivered now in the little alerts, the 100 characters because it fits on a smartphone without scrolling, the way news is delivered now allows so much of the noise to drown out some of the good investigative work. But thank you for that question. I think we're going to get to these last four as quickly as we can. Yes.
Hi, I'm Susan Chattis. I live in Newton, Massachusetts. And to the subject you were just talking about, to me, I'll make it a question.
Good.
How is it, that with all of the things that, you just talked about, that you can legitimize a person like Donald Trump, legitimize a man, who questions the legitimacy of the birth of the first black president, who's opened up a cesspool in this country, and so how does the media deal with that without accepting that? It's really not acceptable stuff.
Well, I think this is the normalization question. I think the 60 million people who voted for him are the people who legitimized him. I think the president whose legitimacy he challenged for 5 years by saying he wasn't a citizen of this country and wasn't born here has said that he's the legitimately elected president of the United States. I think that that is the job he will hold. That's just the fact of it. Now, when you're covering his administration, as you would any administration, the context in which he does things is the larger context is his larger set of policy views, the larger set of things he said, the campaign that he ran. So you don't forget the past, and for him, his past and all of those other things are a part of the context for his presidency. And so they would be, as they would be for any president, the context of their campaign surrounds everything they then do. So it's a part of the conversation.
Last three questions. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get these last three in. Thank you very much, though.
Hi, I'm Kim from Beaverton, Oregon, so far I have the distance record. My question actually goes back to the introduction when there was a reference made to that you may have been in special places on September 11th, and I was wondering if you could give us some insight into where you were on September 11th and what you may have witnessed or seen from a historical standpoint.
I tell you, I will do that, but I'll give you the real short version. At the White House, when John and I cover the White House, there's a small group of reporters, one newspaper, one magazine, one television, one radio, one camera crew, one from each wire service, that actually travels on Air Force One in the motorcade. When that day happened, I just happened to be my turn to ride on Air Force One. But when all hell broke loose, and I was in the classroom when the president heard that whisper, Andy Card, the White House Chief of Staff, knew that I had covered the White House at that point for just over 25 years, and that I understood what was at stake here. This is a doomsday scenario. We had never seen our homes and our businesses and civilians, innocent civilians, targeted and killed this way in a vicious attack. And I argued on board Air Force One. I said, you can't kick us off the plane. It is so important, not just Americans, that the world knows that this government hasn't been brought to its knees. And I give credit to Andy Card, to the White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, Gordon Jandreau, a young aide who was on there. I said, you've got to keep the press on board. So they kicked almost everybody off except me. And I was proud to have been on that plane, knowing that my voice, what I said about who the president was talking to, was not only communicating the hard information, what little hard information, but it also had to express the tone and the concern. And President Bush wanted to get back to Washington. He wanted to speak from the Oval Office to show the United States of America had not been crippled by this. And it was a fascinating, fascinating moment. Thank you for asking. Yes?
Another question from Hyannis for you guys. That is, Ronald Reagan seems to have had Teflon when it came to issues sticking to him. How does Trump manage to do the same thing?
It's a good question.
We don't know yet.
Yes, exactly. We don't know yet, and that's a really important. And then people would say, of course, that Bill Clinton had Teflon too. Of course. The difference now is that politics is so much more polarized. So Donald Trump had, was able to basically turn his team out in the election. So he wasn't Teflon. I mean, he had super high negative ratings. We had the highest negative ratings that we've had of two major candidates since polling started. So he wasn't really, he wasn't Teflon. He just had a more durable core that was willing to not abandon him. And we'll have to see as president how it goes with him.
Hard to remember, Hyannis, but that Ronald Reagan won in 1980 44 states, and in 84 won 49 states. And the only one he lost was his opponent's home state. And we asked him after the election, well, Mr. President, your birthday's coming up. What would you like for your birthday? He said Minnesota would be nice. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Our last question of the evening.
My name is Marcia Bird. I'm from Winchester, Mass. You said something there at the beginning about what John Kennedy said in '63 about how automation is the future. And I remember sitting in a 7th grade social studies class and being told that in Brooklyn, New York, being told you have to go to college. And recently there was an article in the Times, a very long article about Carrier leaving the state of Indiana, and how part of the deal was they were willing to pay for 4 years of college for the employees who were losing their job, as well as severance. Now, whether it was the fault of the article or not, the reporter didn't follow up with questions to the employees about whether any of them were going to take the company up on their offer to pay for 4 years of college. But the world is flat. And what bothers me about this election and the white working class and all these people that are out of work is in all these years, there still seems to be a resistance to the idea that you have to get educated. You have to move forward. Technology has changed the way we work. I don't see Trump taking us in that direction. These promises that he's bringing jobs back are false and empty. And I just see a continuation of this failure to lead. You know, Massachusetts is a bubble. We're doing pretty well, especially in the eastern part of the state. But I think politicians for years have just lied to the public about this issue. And I don't see the press asking politicians about this question.
Well, let's let John answer. And what will the press now have to do? This is a watershed moment for reporters and mainstream journalism as well.
Yeah, I think there's been a fair amount of coverage of the manufacturing sector and the question of whether candidates are really being straight with folks in the Midwest in particular, a crucial swing area in elections, about whether those jobs are ever going to return. 5 million have been lost, I think, since the recession, and manufacturing jobs have been lost. And this is true also in coal country. And you remember, Hillary Clinton took a real hit in West Virginia when she was making an environmental point, but when she said something that suggested she wasn't working all day long to try and keep those coal jobs. Donald Trump has promised in both the Midwest that both those manufacturing jobs are coming back and also that coal jobs are coming back. But if you talk to the senators who represent those states or the politicians running for governor in those states, they say those jobs are not coming back. And it's terrifying and sad because it's not just about people losing their jobs, but it's about whole towns that just disappear, because if the employment isn't there, the towns disappear. And the problem is, in a lot of places where you do mining, call centers have been a big boon to cities and small towns that have had steel plants, for example, that have closed. They've moved in call centers for credit card companies and people can find jobs. You can't do that in mountainous areas where you do mining. You literally, as one politician was explaining to me, you just don't have you can't put a call center on the side of a mountain. So this problem has been out there for a while. I mean, I feel like I certainly have talked about and written about and talked to candidates about this a lot. I think to your question about 4 years of college versus keeping your job, I think a couple of things. You remember when Rick Santorum used to say that it was such a snobbish thing for President Obama to say that everybody should go to college? What he was tapping into, and he was ridiculed for it, but what he was tapping into is the feeling among a lot of people that, don't tell me to go to college. I want to have the job that I was promised, that I like, that my father may have had before me, or that my uncle had. Stop trying to get me to go to college and save my job. I don't want to go to 4 years of college. I don't want to go sit behind a desk. I work with my hands. Don't give me some, person who's 20 years younger than me pointing to some board about some abstract theory. I want to go to my job with my friends, do my job, go home to my family, and feel like that job's going to be there for my son if he wants to do it, or my daughter if she wants to do it. So when you come in and say, well, you can have 4 years of college, it'll be great. They don't want it. There are a lot of people who don't want to hear that because it's beyond that, they can think you're sort of talking down to them. It's a lot more fraught than it might seem.
History teaches us so much about not only where we've been, but where we are. And we can draw lessons from that on where we are headed as well. John Dickerson's done a wonderful job, a bright and sprightly way of drawing those broken links of history. John Dickerson, thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
And you need to thank you all very much for terrific questions tonight. Thank you.
Which way am I going?